Good case studies very clearly state. This is a really, really good question. Salary bands don't really matter. Levels really don't matter anymore. This is officially, I think, session 12. Everyone, when they RSVP, they gave a bunch of questions. So I'm going to choose, I think, the most important ones, and I'll go from there. And then if anyone has any questions near the end, we can take the last 10 minutes or so to go through them really quickly. Right, this is the first question I'm going to answer in detail. Picking this off again to see if there's any traction. I did this for a few months in February and March, and then I wasn't sure if it was useful, so I stopped for a bit. But recently got a lot more requests to keep this going. So the first question here is from Dikshat. How do you figure out your value in the designer job market? I've looked into levels.fya data, but it's sparse for most non-fan companies. And leveling is non-standard across the industry. So this is a really, really good question because it's really key for you to negotiate. A lot of the times people will try and find just like data points online through, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, and levels.fyi, which is mostly for fan companies. I will say levels.fyi is pretty accurate, but it just tells you the average. And Glassdoor and LinkedIn, the salaries tend to be a lot lower than what you can expect, especially Glassdoor, because the breadth of data points tends to be skewed towards people who tend to be looking for jobs a lot, and they tend to be more junior. Ultimately, I still don't think it really, really matters what the standard level is, what the standard salary is. It's more important for you to figure out how to leverage your skill sets and negotiate as high as possible, because that's just going to be like one data point for your negotiation. But the best way is to actually really think about how to position yourself as a valuable / high ROI designer. I talk about this concept a lot, but every business, their goal is obviously to make money, right? And then to make money, you need to spend money. And that's basically going to be your ROI, or return on investment. So typically employees, including designers, their investments. And then employees are split into two categories: cost centers and profit centers. So cost centers have a unclear or ambiguous link to business value. Therefore, ROI is unclear. So examples of this would be customer service, human resources, etc. And previously, also designers. This is actually really important because once you really understand this, the levels really don't matter anymore. Cost centers, unclear / ambiguous link to business value that they create, meaning it's uncertain how much money they bring in the company. So no matter how good you are, if you're perceived as a cost center employee, there's really going to be an upper cap on how much money you can negotiate for your compensation. Profit centers, on the other hand, have a very clear link to business value. ROI is much easier to estimate. Traditionally, this is sales. Difference between cost centers, and profit centers. Cost centers, as I mentioned, was unclear link between employee and business value, unclear ROI, and that means it tends to be harder to negotiate higher salaries. And examples are customer service, HR, formerly designers. This basically means that the business needs these cost centers or expenses to run, but it's unclear how much business value they bring. And previously, designers used to be in this bucket, especially back then when it was mostly graphic designers, because you just make ads, or you create like graphics, or you do some of the visual design, but it's really hard to kind of tie it to the business value. So profit centers, very clear link between employees and business value, clear ROI, much easier to negotiate higher salaries. An example would be tech sales, which I mentioned is actually the highest paid job. It can go up to $1 million a year for the top performing ones, which is insane. But if you think about it from a business perspective, if it costs you $1 million to hire an employee in a profit center, but they bring in $2 million a year. That's like a 2x return on your investment. That's a positive ROI. So nowadays, in the past couple of years, when we saw the paradigm shift go from UX design to product design, that means a lot of modern product designers now have the tools, knowledge, and expertise to really clearly draw the link between the work that they do and business value that they create. So what is business value? Business value for all companies consists of 4 categories: more revenue, reduced costs, user acquisition, and user retention. Typically for more enterprise, SaaS, B2B, or kind of like bigger, more mature companies that have probably IPO'd, they're mostly focused on generating revenue and reducing costs because that ultimately leads to profit. Startups, on the other hand, generally they don't have critical mass. They're still proving their product market fit, and they need to basically demonstrate a lot of strong growth to raise more money and please investors. So startups are going to be mostly concerned with user acquisition or retention. Depending where you want to go into your career, you want to focus on, either the first two if you're going more for enterprise and bigger companies, or the last two if you're going more for startups. So how do designers actually demonstrate and create a link for business value? So traditionally, when you look at, your designs, like what makes a good design? If you ask people like 5-10 years ago, they'll talk about like the aesthetics, the visuals, blah, blah, blah. And that was more in the realm of graphic design. Very unclear link to business value. And I think like 2015 to 2018, like we saw the rise of UI UX designers. And then they were actually mostly concerned about usability, which has a bit of a clearer link to business value because people tend to like to use products that have good usability and are intuitive to use. And that was actually seen as a competitive advantage. And companies started paying designers a lot more because that business value was a little bit more clear. So modern end product designers who are really, really good and understand like product business stats and have more of a experimental and growth-driven mindset, they can kind of work backwards from these business goals, figure out the metrics that are associated with each, and then form hypotheses or like have really clear rationale and demonstrate and get the data for their design decisions that's led to some of these improvements. So I'll give you guys some examples. More revenue. Let's just take an example for a e-commerce business. I know it's not a startup, but this is just like one of the easiest things to really look at. More revenue. So obviously these 4 kind of metrics like revenue, cost, acquisition, retention, these are like really, really big macro conversion metrics, meaning they tend to move very, very slowly, very, very little, and they might not always line up like time scale wise with the work that you've done. And it's very hard to measure and track them directly, or at least tell what was influencing them. So with most macro conversions, there's a lot of micro conversions that funnel up to them. So those are the things that you can work on and measure more directly. And they ultimately will eventually directly or indirectly influence those big macro conversions. So for the macro conversion revenue in the context of the e-commerce business, you would have something like conversion rate, reduce cost. This is going to be more in the realm of like service design or like, time spent on tasks, which is more usability. But this is basically reducing like man hours / headcount requirements to run the business. If you do certain things like build in certain internal tools or improve certain processes, so it becomes much faster for the employees to do certain tasks, this kind of indirectly does reduce cost, as an example. Or if you're looking more into like different growth kind of things, there's some overlap. Like for example, if they spend a lot of money acquiring customers and you figure out like a system where you design certain like ad templates or you do certain things to make that customer acquisition cost cheaper, you're also reducing cost. But that does have some overlap with user acquisition. So user acquisition, this is basically like growth, paid, and organic. So organic would be, like SEO, content marketing, social media, paid, just ads. And then this is where you can talk about things like bounce rate, click-through rate, and customer acquisition cost. And then retention is just measured through like daily active users, monthly active users, weekly active users, and also like engagement metrics. So When you do any sort of project, if you want to be really successful in your career and also get to a point where you can negotiate really high salaries, what you want to do is think about the project, think about what business value it can feasibly create, work backwards, and figure out what metrics you want to optimize for. And then when you design your product, instead of evaluating it from a purely aesthetics or usability perspective, you evaluate it from one of these metric perspectives. And this will often involve getting a baseline measurement of what the metric was before and after you redesigned it. And generally, most things are designed quite poorly. From a growth perspective, it's very easy to apply basic principles to significantly boost these numbers. And then when you go into interviews, instead of just saying like, "Hey, I'm a designer that's really good. I have a lot of experience," be like, "This is the specific business value that I've created, and for your company, this is what I can do in terms of having similar work." Or even throwing a couple ideas on how you can take your current skill set and their current product and improve it in ways that you've done before. And doing that significantly mitigates the risk of you being a negative ROI investment as an employee. And also it clearly demonstrates that you're part of the profit center. Check out goodui.org, A/B tests from big companies. They give you a lot of examples of minor changes will lead to better conversion rates and stuff. There's also marketingexamples.com. This is mostly for content. Growth.design are growth case studies. This is mostly for retention and acquisition. And then there's also useronboard.com, and this is mostly going to be for just acquisition and churn reduction. When people negotiate or when they're offered a particular salary, a lot of companies still see designers as cost center employees, and they have all these fixed bands based off what their market is. But if you get really good at articulating the business value that you've created and you've actually been tracking it throughout your career, you can make a really strong case for hey, I have this track record of, reducing customer acquisition costs across the field. This is my niche. You guys have a really high customer acquisition cost. Let's say it's $1,000 per customer. You have X number of existing customers. You want to grow by this much. It's going to cost you, $4 million. And then I'm asking for a salary of $500K. That becomes a lot more palatable compared to oh, I'm just a really good designer, you should give me more money. Yeah, TLDR, salary bands don't really matter. Salary reference points don't really matter. It's really about the business value you create, how clearly you can articulate it and demonstrate it, and how that will minimize the perception of risk as hiring you in as a profit center employee. And oftentimes you can actually get much higher salaries above the band of what you're looking for. I know I didn't really directly answer the question, but I think this is mindset to have. What are your thoughts? You can drop in a comment. Oh, can you give an example of what you, okay, cool. And then I was on the growth design team. At that point, the business problem I wanted to solve was user acquisition and reducing costs. I did some research into the company, and this was me joining out of school. I didn't really have any experience. I wasn't really assigned to anything. They're just hey, we haven't matched you with the team yet. Just do some digging and learn about the company and let us know if you have any ideas. I realized that their customer acquisition cost was around $2,200 to convert one customer through various channels ads, blah, 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 etc. And then I'm this is a ridiculous amount. It's really, really high. What are the current ways we're attracting people? So a lot of it was just from ads, email marketing, and actually a lot of it was ads in the millions or tens of millions of dollars. I had a hypothesis from the funnel perspective, the target customer was a merchant/entrepreneur. And one of the top searches for that particular segment or funnel was, how do I create/find a logo for my new business? And then I went on Google and I looked at the keyword density, and it was hundreds of thousands of searches per month, search volume per month, plus low competition for free options. So then I essentially made a proposal that, we should build our in-house logo generator and make it a requirement to input their email or opt into, email acquisition funnel, the email drip campaign to claim their logo. And then that essentially generated hundreds of thousands of leads over 3 or 4 million over the course of 2 years. virtually for free just through organic search and very, very high ROI, high click-through rate ads, which had a much better performance compared to just standard ads. And then that lowered the customer acquisition cost from like 2.2K to, let's say, this is just like a random number. I don't have the exact one anymore. It's like 1,500, right? So then that basically results in like a 700 reduction in CAC per customer. And then you take like $700 times like the number of users that you got, which I think was like 4 mil. You get like a big fat dollar value. And when you negotiate with your next company, you talk about their user acquisition problems / opportunities. You can make an assumption on what it is and what their current channels are. And then you can raise this as a case study and say, hey, like I already did this one time for this other company that's similar to you, and are building like experimental growth products that drove a lot of free organic traffic and converted leads into customers at a much lower CAC. If I were to do like a back of the napkin calculation for you guys, like, I could do the same thing in like, 2 years and like save you this much money in CAC costs. Therefore, I feel like asking for an XYZ salary, which usually is multiple times higher or like a lot higher above like the maximum pay band for the level, that becomes like a lot easier to negotiate because, like for any business owner, like if you ask them to like give you $1 and then you give them $2 back, like everyone would take that deal a unlimited number of times. So it's really about articulating business value, tracking it, and then using that in negotiations. And typically this only really works well if like it's very obvious that like, oh, like this company and your past company or this type of work and that you're going into to do and the work that you've done before is very, very similar. The stretch isn't as big. If I were to like go into like a enterprise SaaS company and be like, hey, I can increase your revenue, like this case study wouldn't be as good. So that's also why I always advocate for like having a niche or a domain that's specifically tied to business value that you can just keep like snowballing through your career. Does that answer your question, Dorothy? Yeah, that's a good question. So there's actually something called a brag document that you should be doing. What this means is like every email, Slack message, metric, whatever you've done that kind of, talks positively about yourself or the work that you've done, you should take a screenshot of it and put it in Google Drive and do this like once a week. Every time you look for a new job, when you're writing your resume or doing your case study, you can go back and refer to it. So that's something that I've been basically doing since like my first job. And now it's like, like hundreds of like screenshots. I can easily go in and like pull these out when I need to create new case studies. And I always try and like just like make friends with the data people or the engineering people and just like constantly ask for updates on these numbers. And typically they will always give it to you because it's still a valuable input for you to make better design decisions. Does that answer your question? Yeah, don't try and remember it because it's guaranteed you're going to forget. And also having these screenshots will be good because you'll always be able to provide the proof if they really do ask for it, although that's never happened before. What differentiates a good case study from a bad one? There are so many portfolios out there. How do employers differentiate candidates? So there's actually like a really big problem right now, especially in the junior designer market, because it's being flooded by new bootcamp graduates. A very mixed, slightly negative opinions on how bootcamp is currently structured because, they do that whole promise that, you're going to guarantee a job. And then they teach like very, very cookie cutter design processes. The majority of it, I think, is overemphasized in user research. So a lot of the portfolio case studies we see from new graduates, they're always like the same standard like formats, like, oh, like here is a prom. I did some user interviews. Here's a persona. Here's a wireframe. Here's like a mock-up. Here's a prototype. And then maybe they do usability testing at the end. And it's like the same cookie cutter template. So that's still kind of like, 2014, 2015. It doesn't really have a business goal attached to it and it doesn't have a very specific problem to solve. Improving the usability is always good and something that you always want to keep in mind, but it's not actually a problem. So good case studies very clearly state like a problem that they're trying to solve. And then they have a kind of a very specific process that is unique to them that they use to solve it and validate it. And a lot of the times, you probably will skip a lot of the standard design processes because you never get enough time to do this in industry or in real life. You usually have to like, really prioritize how you allocate and spend your resources. So a mark of a really good case study is like being very specific on the problem that you're solving and not just going through the motions that they might have taught you or what you've like read online, because there's a lot of like cookie cutter templates. It was good a couple years ago, but nowadays like it's way more competitive and you just want to demonstrate that you know how to solve business problems. Next question from Serena Chan. How to best deal with conflicting feedback from different teams? Design versus leadership versus engineering versus product. So this is really common. Typically, all good product decisions are made using a trifecta or quadfecta system. What that means is there's input from engineering, from product management, from design, from data, from like many other disciplines. It's intentionally designed this way because the best decisions are always made if you have multidisciplinary input from people in different fields, because they consider all facets of a problem. So like design will consider, usability, they'll consider like user goals. Engineering will be like feasibility, privacy, stability, scalability. Product is like business goals, data, like there's a lot of aspects to it. So the best way to really think about this is like, there's always gonna be conflicts, and that's very normal. As a designer, you should be kind of taking in all those inputs and kind of processing it in a way that makes sense for you and validating them in a way that connects user goals to the business goals. But you don't need to like make everyone happy, because you would never finish, right? Like there's this, like the term for this is design by committee, and it's like the worst process. Like no company that is designed forward really advocates for this. Your job as a designer isn't to make all the stakeholders happy. It's to actually take the input from everyone, but only use what makes sense to you. And as long as you're able to validate the user goals and business goals and connect it to, generally that'll be okay. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can elaborate if it doesn't. I'll answer that one right after. Effective ways of presenting case studies. Do you think these can be replaced with slide decks? Yes, for all designers of all levels, unless you're a freelancer or trying to get a lot of leads publicly, you don't need a website. It's much better to use Google Slides because it lets you focus on the content. There's no loading issues, no navigation issues, and it's very easy for people to jump around and view things quickly. If you do a case study like on a website, it actually has a lot of risk associated, because there could be all sorts of issues with like performance, loading, usability issues with navigation. That won't change the amount of time a recruiter or screener spends looking at your portfolio. They usually spend, 2 to 5 minutes. If they waste 2 minutes trying to get it to load and find the right case study, then that's less time they're spending looking at your content. So always go for a Google slide deck, unless you're doing freelance. So from Vishnu, how do you show your value as a junior designer? Obviously, you show all this like business value stuff, but as a junior designer, you probably haven't worked on enough projects to really have this fully fleshed out. So 2 very good ways of demonstrating value as a junior designer. One is leveraging your domain context. Domain context could be, cultural. It could be through language. It could be through a specific industry, a group, or identity. Like if you have like proximity to like the industry or the end user for the product, you can leverage that as a junior designer because you bring that unique perspective. Generally, the value of junior designers is that it tends to question things in a good way. They'll kind of like be that pair of fresh eyes. And a lot of times where senior designers have been working on a product for a long time, they get tunnel vision and they start to kind of miss things and make assumptions. The junior designer bringing that new perspective is always valuable, but it's only valuable if you actually voice your opinions and actually aren't afraid to speak up. So that's the value that you would provide. Also, any additional accessory skills that you have that's like tangentially related to what you're doing is always valuable as well. Typically, as a junior designer, they're not going to expect like crazy product making skills. As long as you meet the bar for visual and interaction design and have some sort of domain context they can leverage, you'll be in a good position. In terms of good case studies that I've come across recently, I don't have any that's public because they've all been through interviews and they've actually mostly been through slides. But the 2 good websites I remember that are good are Codefolios and Case Study Club. But I haven't looked at those websites in a few years. I don't know if they're still kind of UX portfolios or product portfolios, but that would be probably the way to go. Thank you everyone for joining. If you thought this was useful, you want to see this weekly, leave a comment in the group and I'll keep this going.